One of the questions that early on preoccupied Seamus Heaney was whether or not you could be called an Irish writer if you wrote in English. Now that might seem odd to us these days, the answer of course being yes, but it was nevertheless a concern for him. From school in Derry and elsewhere, he had a strong sense of our Irish heritage, and he did a lot of his early reading in Marfelt Library, which I'm happy to say, and from Marfelt myself. And we know that he picked up Robert Farren's The Course of Irish Verse, a book which, as he said himself, adopted the idea of drawing from native sources. And Bernard O'Donoghue, of course, in his great study of Heaney, has also drawn attention to the question of Irish or English lyric in Heaney's first book, Death of a Naturalist. But I suppose one of the questions we might ask at the outset today is whether Heaney himself spoke Irish. Well, the answer is, in adulthood at least, not really. As he said himself, he could read a bit of Irish in the papers and listen to the Irish radio, but in his own terms, that was about the height of it. But as we see in poems such as The Shooting Script from the Hall Lantern, he was always alert to the possibility of the language's renewal and its enduring value. He said that, "I don't believe that faith in Irish as a language is misplaced. The evidence suggests that it now inheres in the cultural imagination of the Anglophone Ireland as a vital element." I don't think anybody would argue with that. But having said that, in preparing for this talk today, I was struck by Heaney's emphasis on the otherness of Irish. Perhaps the clue was always in the need to study the language rather than to simply draw on it. To study the heritage rather than to simply draw on it. I mean, he claimed that the theoretical baggage of the likes of Farren and Thomas MacDonagh, Austin Clarke, among others, had no real force when it came time to write. As he said in Stepping Stones, that the writing has to flow in your limbs and joints, and the linguistic experiences that threw my switches were in English. So, being an Irish writer who wrote in English was more to do with squaring experiential fact with cultural pieties, and we get the classic account of this in Heaney's 1983 lecture among school children. When he first felt the gap widening between his home life in Derry and his academic life in Belfast, it was actually Daniel Corkery's well-known Head in Ireland that came to the rescue for him. But eventually, and obviously, Heaney couldn't take the line of, say, Sean O'Riordan. And as he says in the lecture, he felt himself head-on with the likes of O'Riordan because of the demand to drop the English literature heritage. So Joyce, of course, played a part in the liberation from this kind of mythology, and refusing as he did to replace the myth of alien superiority of the English with the myth of native superiority. Now, most of you, or at least some of you, will know I'm sticking quite close to the Heaney line and the Heaney narrative, which is always comprehensive. And in the same lecture, he would make us see a poem like Broch from Wintering Out. He'd make us see this, make it part of this discussion. Because he discussed how Broch was the Irish for Riverbank, as a lot of people will know, and how their own riverbank at home was called the Long Rigs, which, as he points out, could have been a Scottish term maybe brought over by the planters in the 17th century. It was, and I think he was fair to use it as a good representation of his full heritage and a fusion of Irish, English and Ulster-Scots, which I'll discuss today. But in discussing the blend of Irish, English and Ulster-Scots in Heaney, it might have done to focus on such instances, especially these place name poems, because he had, of course, felt it a very powerful source of identity and part of his personal story, as we saw in 1977 when he delivered a monumental lecture, The Sense of Place. Now, at that time, he was completely committed to the belief that we could, in John Montagu's terms, we could regain the skill to read the landscape, the Irish landscape, as a manuscript, a kind of sacred manuscript, alive with what he called invisible realities. Now, obviously, not everyone accepted that, including Heaney's good friend, the poet Derek Mahon, the late Derek Mahon. And there would, I mean, after all, there would be a huge intensity of change that could obscure the bigger story of Heaney's life and work if we focused on those names. And similar reasons apply to the reason I've opted not to discuss, say, the fusion of Irish, English and Ulster-Scots in Heaney's major Irish translation, Sweeney Astray. I mean, that could have constituted a talk on its own, because it is, after all, an Irish text set in Ulster-Scots territory and translated into English, so it could have been ideal. But like Broke, Heaney also wanted that text, which was published in 1983, at the same time as the lecture I mentioned earlier. He wanted to be something which could be adhered to by Ulster Unionists and Ulster Nationalists. That was probably ambitious, but the more pressing point is the fact that Sweeney Astray really becomes absorbed into the bigger story of Heaney's oeuvre, and most immediately actually becomes absorbed into the book in 1984, Station Island. But what I want to show is that Heaney's story is a big story, a broader story than that. And so this will also affect how we discuss the more surprising aspect of his work, the Ulster-Scots dimension. And so for similar reasons, I will not focus on things like Burns' art speech, or A Burial for Burns, or say the Ulster-Scottishness of Beowulf, the translation, or the translation of Robert Henryson, who Heaney described as giving him, I think, a hidden Scotland. Because the primary emphasis of today's talk is the idea that the fusion of language suggests, I think, a bigger personal vision that goes beyond a kind of passive register of the given world. And I think what we have in Heaney is what he once said of his friend Brian Free. He said that by telling his fable, his truth, he has given his audience access to their own possibilities and reminded them of their limitations. So I want to start with a couple of points about the bigger fable, the bigger truth, and in the bigger context. The great Irish critic John Wilson Foster, who's been one of the most astute readers of Heaney's work from the beginning, has been long alert to the sense of a storyline in Heaney's poetry. And in 2014, a year after Heaney's passing, Foster looked back at the work and came up with some hugely interesting ideas. And one of them was that Heaney had written what he called an automythography, which, aside from a synthesis of different traditions and mythologies, was also about living out life as a kind of difficult script already written. And elsewhere, a few years before that, Foster described how Heaney had created really a poetic world which was real enough for him to dwell on as well as dwell in, what he called an enviable globe, which was a kind of enviable critical term in itself. So this is the second point then about this globe of experience. I tend to read Heaney's volumes his major volumes, in three parts. Now he's helped us along with this interpretation, because he once said that his first four books constituted one book, in that they grew together and go together. And around the same time, he was also bold enough to say that he was fashioning a kind of, in the Yeatsian effort, a coherent oeuvre. And his friend Ram Brands has since shown how conscious the effort was. But of course, neither of them were bold enough to say what shape it was going to take, and which was fair enough. But and Bernard O'Donoghue actually warned us that as late as 2016 was warning us that it was still too early to say. But I do think there are good reasons to take the tripartite approach, or at least apply the tripartite model. And that's what I'll do today before I discuss Ulster-Scots. So just to recap then, what we have is, in the three-part vision of Heaney's work, we would have in the first book, Death of a Naturalist at 66, Door into the Dark in 69, Wintering Out in 72, and then ending with North in 75. That's the first book. The second book then would be Fieldwork in 79, Station Island in 84, The Hollander in 87, and Seeing Things in 1991. That's the second part. The third part then, of course, would be The Spirit Level in 95, Electric Light in 2001, District and Circle in 2006, and Human Chain is the last book in 2010. Now, that takes me then to a third point about this story, about this automythography, namely the nature of the story and the relationship between these books. For me and for Foster, I think, it's really a spiritual story, a kind of pilgrim's progress, and what I would add is that it has a definite element of spiritual enlightenment. Because looking at his life, looking at his books, the three phases that are identified here remind me less, as it might have done in the past, of Dante's Divine Comedy than the 12th century Zen Buddhist monk who famously described three phases to enlightenment in a kind of paradoxical way, which goes something like: before enlightenment, the mountains were mountains and the rivers were rivers. While I sought enlightenment, the mountains were not mountains and the rivers were not rivers. When I attained enlightenment, the mountains were mountains and the rivers were rivers. Well, as I say, it's paradoxical. So what does it mean? Well, I think it fits well with Heaney's spiritual progress. Because if we think back to the place of Broch, that quietus of things, the world of pitchfork and plough, that all brought him fame really in his early life. And he wasn't interested in idealism. He wasn't interested in change. And he, as he said that in the great poem, The Ministry of Fear, all he wanted to do, unlike his friend, the late Seamus Heaney, who was interested in ideas, all Heaney wanted to do was write about the sycamore, meaning that he wanted to present reality as we all know it from common sense and common experience. So the mountains were mountains too. The second stage, after North, beginning with Fieldwork, sees reality in a new and often very strange light. And it's, I think, in an attempt really to conjure a transcendent ground. I mean, the physical world, as he says in one of the poems in Station Island, hardly attempts him to credit it. So in this pursuit of transcendence, or this pursuit of enlightenment, leaves us feeling that the mountains are not mountains, maybe. But when it comes to the third phase, when the mountains are mountains, it doesn't mean that he's disregarded the earlier phase of his life, those days of Broch. In fact, it's more that he sees anew that the mountains are mountains, but with a richer understanding of what that actually means. It becomes a synthesis of opposites of the two periods in his life, the kind of yin and yang, the cosmology that Heaney even used to describe the Anglican via media of George Herbert. And I think really, as an aside, that Buddhists should no doubt find in Heaney's middle voice, his kind of distant middle voice in the late work, a powerful representative of what they call the middle way. But that's the structure, and that's how I tend to read Heaney's work, and that's where I want to discuss what is really a surprising but pervasive strand of Ulster-Scots. Well, maybe we shouldn't be so surprised, but I'll return to that at the end. So in this context, I think that even a basic survey of each phase shows that a Scottish and Ulster-Scots dimension, and even at times a Presbyterian dimension to Heaney's aesthetic, and a strikingly evident from the beginning. So take as the most famous poem, Digging, from Death of a Naturalist, which is arguably his most famous volume. It channels, as he said, the Scottish element of his first speech, and even a poem like The Diviner in the same volume owes a debt to John Hewitt, specifically John Hewitt's poem The Glens. Moving on then, in the same phase, Requiem for the Croppies, Endure into the Dark, it celebrates the United Irishmen, a group with a complicated relationship to Ulster Presbyterianism. Moving on again, in the same phase, Wandering Out, draws on W.F. Marshall, the Tyrone poet who enjoys a central place in Ulster-Scots heritage. And Wandering Out also contains the well-known The Other Side, and it's a contested poem really about Protestant and Catholic divisions in rural Northern Ireland, which admittedly places Ulster-Scots outside the speaker's world. But then, if we go back to Brough, we do know that Heaney wanted to celebrate the shared heritage, the underlying Scottish strain in our Ulster speech. And then in the same phase, in 1975, in the volume North, he kind of exercises, or at least represents, the intellect and rationality which he associated with the Scottish Presbyterianism of Ian Crichton Smith. So that's the first phase, which is pretty dense with Ulster-Scots. And the second phase is surprisingly rich with Ulster-Scots too. A fieldwork in 1979, which is a kind of mixture between Robert Lowell and William Wordsworth. It's an intensely romantic book, and it's in its intimations of visionary experience, or its aspirations for visionary experience. The Boor Tree becomes a kind of expression of pure individuality before we learn how to describe them properly. And it's an Ulster-Scots term for elderberry. Moving on in the same phase, if we go to Station Island, we'll see poems like The Loaning, which includes a section entitled I, another Ulster-Scots term, and Graniteship, where the subject is an Aberdeen of the mind. Clearances, in his next book, we move on to The Hollandron, it traces, and this is something that hasn't, as far as I know, been discussed, is Heaney's maternal Protestant lineage, and it employs the Ulster-Scots in an ethical and psychological portrait of the mother-son relationship, where he says he would gnaw and I to keep him and his mother allied and at bay. And then again in the same phase, in this intense phase of change, the visionary volume, Seeing Things, in 91, it has poems like The Settle Bed, which arguably revisits the other side from Wandering Out, rehearsing, as he says, anthems of Ulster, unwilling, unbeaten, Protestant, Catholic, the Bible that beats. And then in the same book, we have Hewitt again, whose intellect and art are celebrated by the school bag, and we also have one of Heaney's most important self-portraits, perhaps the most important, Fosterling, which hinges on, really, the Ulster-Scots terms glower and glit. Now I'll return to those. So that's our first two phases. Both play a huge role in what I've described as the autumn mythography, and this sort of journey towards enlightenment, or the effort towards enlightenment. Now, so in the third phase, it continues right to the end. An invocation from the spirit level celebrates the Scottish visionary poet Hugh MacDiarmid. The Gravel Walks is influenced by Elizabeth Bishop, with whom Heaney associated the Ulster-Scots, and we might also note that Shakespeare's Scottish play informs the scheme of Keeping Going, which also involves bagpipes and sporran. Electric Light, moving on, which also contains references to Macbeth, revisits the legacy of the United Irishmen in the poem at Tunbridge. It enjoys a pervasive, albeit elegiac, Scottish dimension. Poems like Would They Had Stayed is devoted to Scottish poets, while poems like Late in the Day, drawing on William Wilde's Beauties of the Boyne, which touches on the symbolic locus of Ulster Unionism and the Ulster-Scots tradition, meditates on the life of David Thompson and his memoir on growing up in Scotland. And late in Heaney's own day, of course, in 2006, when he published his 11th and penultimate major book, District and Circle, poems such as Anna Horish 1944 were still sounding out a thick Ulster-Scots voice from the past, in this case the Second World War. And another poem in the same book, Quitting Time, speaks beautifully, really, of reading up the work. Again, another Ulster-Scots term, in this case, about putting things in order. Now, that takes us right up to the end, and I think Heaney once said that there was a hidden Scotland in the back of his mind that he heard among Ulster-Scots at the cattle fairs. But if it was at the back of his mind, I think it's also fair to say that it was always fairly close to the tip of his tongue. So, well, what are the implications of all this at this point? Well, John Wilson Foster, who I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, he also argued in 1995 that Heaney remained disinclined to explore the Scots-Irish, the majority population of Northern Ireland, and offers them as representations merely of the others, meaning that large tracts of Ulster, both literal and figurative, are simply missing from the sizable acreage of Heaney's 200-odd collected poems. That feels broadly true, but there are other critics thinking of Foster here who have argued much more problematically that Heaney was engaged in a belated recovery project that, and I quote, he likely realised the paucity of the Scots-Irish or Ulster-Scots presence in his own work and strove to remedy it so that his own version of regionalism would represent the entirety of Northern Ireland's population. Now, you can probably tell by my face that doesn't seem quite right, and I think even the basic survey of the poem suggests that this wasn't quite right. In addition to that, the theorising of what Ulster-Scots was, or is, has been a relatively recent phenomenon. And John Hewitt aside, it would have been niche scholarship, though of course we do wonder, if Heaney came into formal contact with Ulster-Scots in English language courses at Queen's University. Edna Longley once applauded Heaney for his use of authentic Ulster-Scots, for offering us a kind of portrait which showed how the language may be, as she said, prevented from being cordoned off in a linguistic zoo park as a kind of backward species whose robust primitivism may one day contribute to the national bloodstock. But I mean, then again, there are obvious limitations. As attractive as that is, there are obvious limitations to such concerns with authenticity, given that Ulster-Scots can be put to creative use, as I think we've seen in even our basic survey of the poems. Now, when I talked earlier in the year about Heaney and Ulster-Scots, I began by saying that in 2008 he was named in Frank Ferguson's Anthology of Ulster-Scots Writing, which was published by Four Courts Press in Dublin. Well, I said it was published without any fuss, so why would I think there would be a fuss? Well, as I pointed out at the time, Dr. Ferguson and the publishing house really were relatively fortunate in that they didn't suffer the same kind of fate as Andrew Motion and Blake Morrison, who famously put Heaney in the Penguin Book of Contemporary British Verse back in 1982. Now, of course, Heaney would always be opposed to what he called the misnomer British in that title. And of course, in the following year, he famously printed a protest called, a friendly protest really, called An Open Letter, which actually drew in Robert Burns. Now, as far as I know, there's no record of any such objection to the Ulster-Scots label, and as far as I know, there was never any in the making. So what I questioned at the time was whether Dr. Ferguson maybe got off a little lightly compared to those other poor anthologists. But of course, I think, as you'll probably have gathered at this point, I think that Ferguson had made an important step in our understanding of not only Heaney, but of ourselves, of our own heritage here. Because Ulster-Scots, as Ferguson says, the literary expressions of Ulster-Scots give us a primary example of transnational cultural production in a location which is one of the major fault lines of the British-Irish relationship. It is a component, Ferguson says, of this interaction which should offer many insights into the troubled history of this part of the world. Now, more to the point of Heaney's particular story, Ferguson also points out that for some, a single word or phrase has been used to colour a thought or passage with the aid of Ulster-Scots. And I think this is the case in Heaney. But before I dwell on that, there are other things that we shouldn't shy away from when we consider Ulster-Scots and Seamus Heaney. Is that it raises really constitutional questions at a time when constitutional questions are apparently back on the table. But then again, I suppose they're always on the table here. But just take for instance Heaney's 1993 lecture, The Frontier of Writing. It's an Oxford lecture actually, which drew out a map of a kind of borderless Ireland, encouraged us to look through the perspective of Louis MacNeice, casting him as a kind of antidote to John Hewitt, whose unionism, in Heaney's terms, could never have suited the sense of dispossession and political marginalisation of the Catholics. Well, perhaps, but the Ulster-Scots dimension of Heaney's work invites us to re-examine the kind of nationalist assumptions behind that literary map. And we should maybe pose the broader and certainly more pressing questions of whether it is desirable or even rational to consider support for even literary kind of versions of unionism as cultural or political apostasy for Catholics, lapsed or otherwise, in the North today. I mean, I think we have to look again at those Ireland-centred visions of Heaney's and see if the poetry maybe tells a different story to the prose here. Because I think it does, and I think it looks quite complicated. It points to other unions and regionalisms that can find ways to incorporate Scotland. And Wesley Hutchinson's recent study, tracing the Ulster-Scots imagination, further adds to the complication by showing, albeit inadvertently, just how close Heaney's vision comes to the Ulster-Scots. And if it wasn't complicated enough, a very large element of the Ulster-Scottish story is the Irish Catholic diaspora in Scotland. And I understand that we're venturing off in here which aren't purely linguistic or artistic discussion. Though maybe it is. I mean, if it was surprising at the time to see, as I've kind of suggested it might have been, if it was surprising to see Heaney in Ferguson's Anthology, it also had, I think, an air of inevitability. But I'll end with a note on the bigger story, how Ulster-Scots played a fundamental role, not just in Heaney's engagement with this place, but also in his self-directed and increasingly self-aware spiritual enlightenment and inquiry, and how it, and excuse the jargon here, but how it colours not only a thought or a passage, but actually a kind of whole ontology. I mean, earlier on I mentioned the terms glar and glit. Glar broadly means mud, and glit sort of broadly means motes or scum in water. Now, in the poem, in Fosterling, they become associated with what Heaney calls the heaviness of being. And that's a term that's been associated with district and circle, where we still hear that thick Ulster-Scots voice. But this is the ontological part, this heaviness of being, that these Ulster-Scots terms take on. We're seeing things as a whole was dedicated to Derek Mahan, who I also mentioned earlier, and I mentioned that he wasn't happy with Heaney's initial approach to place and the Irish heritage, the Ulster heritage, and he once advised Heaney in 72, I think, in a famous line to revise his insolent ontology. Now, in this poem, I think we witness in miniature this act of revision, or at least a kind of symbol of it, because the trajectory is vertical. Heaney is making a deliberate effort to move up and away to credit marvels, as he said. So it's a positive note that moves away from Ulster, moves away from Ulster-Scots, moves away from the Ulster-Scots terms. I think we have to just not be so fast to see this as purely positive. Because what I think we have in Heaney here is the kind of rebellion against limits, which he once described as being so convincing, or only convincing really, when the yes of the rebellion contains a no. Now, given what I hope to have shown as the fundamental importance of Ulster-Scots to this fundamental portrait and of the story as a whole, that story of enlightenment, I'm starting to wonder, and this is where my research is starting to go, if we might be better to say that in this poem and in this story as the whole, if we would be better and closer to the truth if we said that the eye of possibility here really contains a gnaw of limitation. Well, thank you very much. That's all I have for today, and many thanks to Paul O'Friel for inviting me. I hope you enjoy the rest of the series. Thank you very much.